tell us a little bit about yourself, your history here, and kind of your origins in the subject matter of Goaltown.
Well, I'm an inactive member of the Oregon State Bar. I'm a Metro Counselor representing Southeast and Southwest Portland. And beginning in 1974 actually, I had sort of a first-hand seat and then an active role in some of the implementation steps around the statewide planning goals. A small role in the goal adoption process. I'm a member of a technical advisory committee or citizen advisory committee that was pulled together for each goal. And the urban transition goal was one of the 15 or 16 under discussion at the beginning of time. That was 74. In 75, I graduated from law school. Henry Richmond hired me and Dick Benner to be his initial staff at 1,000 Friends of Oregon. He founded 1,000 Friends of Oregon to seek the proper implementation of the statewide planning goals and to protect Senate Bill 100. He recruited Tom McCall to be co-founder and chair of the advisory board as Governor McCall was leaving office at the end of 74, beginning of 75, and assembled an impressive advisory committee of leading statespeople and business people in Oregon at that time. And famous in my recollection, handed both me and Dick Benner stacks of files of cases he'd already filed in circuit court or elsewhere, challenging various land use decisions of local governments in September of 1975. None of those was about the housing goal. They were all about farmland, some about forest land, some about citizens' rights of access to the appeals process, a little bit of sprawl-related, urban development-related things, but nothing about housing. So I was not on the technical advisory committee on the housing goal. All I knew about it or thought I knew about it, I have no current recollection, but what I carry forward from that time is that was Fred Van Atta. Fred got in there and made sure that there was something for the development side. This was the Land Conservation and Development Commission, and Fred Van Atta, the president, CEO, chief lobbyist for the state home builders, had been very active in opposing and then grudgingly going along with, this is my recollection, Fred could correct it, many people could correct it probably, with Senate Bill 100 as it went through the legislature. And I'm sure he had discussions, principally with L.B. Day after L.B. was appointed chair of the commission, about making sure there would be something for the development side and a housing goal that called out important objectives. I was oblivious to it. I mean, I recognized it was important, but that wasn't what I had been focusing on. I was focusing on the comprehensiveness of the goals, on whether they were clear enough and strongly stated enough to make a real difference in how local governments would do plans, some of those local governments for the first time. But to be very frank, I was focusing on rural resource lands, coast, agricultural land, and urban growth boundaries as a tool for protecting those areas. That is, restricting or limiting the extent of urban development into farmland. So Henry, in formulating 1,000 Friends mission, had been on that same track. We're going to make sure that citizens have rights, can participate, but all the examples that came forward were from the countryside. And so we found ourselves responding to citizen requests and to our own learning about various land use matters and intervened in principally agricultural and forest land kinds of cases. Then in 1976, a coalition of interests, including the state home builders, put Measure 10 on the ballot, which would have repealed Senate Bill 100 and the goals. So Henry, with the full panic mode, as he should have, helped with the building of a coalition that certainly transcended 1,000 Friends of Oregon. Halleck, the former governor, Tom McCall, Bob Straub, the current governor, all spoke out forcefully against it, as did other leading figures from the legislature and elsewhere. And we won. We won 57%, I think was the margin of victory. Henry was pretty concerned about that out-of-the-gate repeal effort, which had been foreshadowed by an effort to refer Senate Bill 100 before it took effect back in, would have been 73, 74. So he got busy thinking about how do we align the interests of business with the statewide land use planning program. He'd already made major overtures to the forest products industry. We were working with a lot of farmers who were real commercial farmers who really supported the land use planning system as it applied to agricultural land. Hector McPherson is an obvious example, but there were many others. In forestry, I'm going to forget, Weyerhaeuser's lobbyist. Ward Armstrong had been very active in the work of passing Senate Bill 100 through the 73 legislature, and Henry reached out to Ward, reached out to Jana McLennan, who was on Straub's staff as his natural resources advisor and who knew a lot about the timber industry, and got to know those people as best he could, and talked about how maintaining the forest land base could be very important to the forest industry, just as it was to agriculture, and that land use planning could play a role in that. Now it was time to focus on the home builders, because here's a big threat. The home builders, notwithstanding their participation, had participated in the legislature, had participated in this campaign. So how do we reach them? That's when we discovered Goal 10. Just to be clear, we fancied ourselves, planning advocates, but we had a pretty myopic perspective. And we decided we needed to gear up for this. He hired Mark Greenfield and a planner named Pam, Mark will remember her name, who were dedicated exclusively to figuring out what our strategy should be with respect to the housing goal. And he asked me to oversee that work. Mark and Pam dived into research. Henry had his antennae up looking for test cases. What can we do? I mean, how can we bring forward some of these theories that Mark has identified? You can't do anything to increase housing cost. You have to provide for all kinds of needed housing in your plans. There has to be an adequate supply of land to allow a number of rent levels and price ranges for each housing type. What can we do about that? What's the state of current planning and zoning? So Mark and Pam undertook the survey of metropolitan area zoning of residential land, and the statistics they gleaned were that something like only 7% of residentially designated land was designated for multifamily, and that 80-some% of the land, the vacant land zoned single family, was in lot sizes of 10,000 square feet or more. And there was some then shocking number describing the difference between the cost of land in a 10,000 square foot lot versus 5,000 square feet. Doesn't sound that bad today because we've gone through a great deal of price escalation since then. But even the idea that a system development charge might be an undue burden on the cost of housing was something we were looking at. And certainly this idea that there wasn't enough land zoned for multi-dwelling development. In fact, in some cities, no such zoning rang a bell for a lawyer, because there had been that Mount Laurel decision, the initial Mount Laurel case in WCP versus Mount Laurel Township in New Jersey. The New Jersey court, from our perspective, more or less out of thin air, developed a doctrine under New Jersey constitutional law that you couldn't simply zone out entire economic strata by saying large lot, single family only in our community. Even if somebody wanted to come in and build lower cost housing in multi-dwelling in that case, it wasn't allowed in Mount Laurel, and the court said that wasn't adequate. And later they developed a doctrine of fair share, looking at a metropolitan area and talking about what each municipality's burden would be. Henry said, look, we could do that here. We've got the goal. The goal says this stuff. We need to use the administrative rules. Somebody really smart wrote this goal. I don't know who it was, but it was probably Herb Riley and Jim Knight, and the economist that they had working with them. So you have this ferment. Henry's pacing up and down, meeting with Burton Wiest, who is heading up the Metro Home Builders. You are going to interview Henry. You need to interview Henry about this if you haven't. Burton was the head of the Metro Home Builders Association, their executive director, staff person. And he was receptive to the idea that we could use LCDC. And Henry was very aggressive in how he put it, gotta stick it to these cities. They're not doing their job, and we can work together to change how this stuff happens. And the statewide planning goals are good for housing, over and over. And then we'd walk down the hall and say, Brother Bob, Mark, got any cases for us yet? So it was a dismal day when we learned that Alan Johnson had filed the case Seaman versus City of Durham, and then won against the City of Durham in a case that harkened back to Mount Laurel and talked about Goal 10 prescribing that Durham could not zone out multifamily housing. That was disappointing to Henry, to say the least, that somebody got in there first. Sort of like the moonshot day, or the early days of the space program when the Russians got into orbit first. And there was a lot of gnashing of teeth, and all we could do was pop a little rocket up and splash down in the Atlantic again. I was a kid then. That's what came into my mind. We got beaten. So we had to outperform. So we kept trying to work with the home builders. We asked Burton's advice, and on his advice, I think, asked Dale DeHarport to join 1,000 Friends Board. Henry made that invitation. Those were the days when, unashamedly, the founding director would say, I'm going to pick this person for my board, and then tell the board chairman about it. I remember the day I was supposed to I did make a presentation to the board about where we're going to go with this housing stuff. We had not yet filed any cases, but this is probably before we hired Mark and Pam, getting authorization for this new program area and Henry's ideas for funding it. And it was not a happy meeting. There was active opposition to the idea. The thoughtful expression of it was, we have a niche. Our niche is to protect farmland and forest land. We know what we're doing here, and we don't want to thin the soup and wander into areas we don't understand. And for some others, it was, I don't care about those people. They're just trying to rape and pillage, and giving them free legal advice, the builders, that's absurd. That's not a public interest. At least one board member, Claudia Burton, a law professor at Willamette, resigned from the board in protest. I think other people left quietly. It was a very shaky time, and we got letters from members and all kinds of things. Henry was resolute, and he said, this Measure 10 that we just squeaked by on, it's going to come back. They're not going to stop until they get this program, or we keep them from doing it by changing the politics. And we got to keep working harder and harder. So next thing I know, I'm standing in the City Hall / firehouse of the city of Beaverton with Steve Janik and a massive home builders to tell Jack, then mayor of Beaverton, that his moratorium, a service moratorium, they were concerned about water supply and at least one other service, and they decided the only way to protect the city's quality of life and its fisc was to put in place a moratorium on residential development. So we helped the home builders land like a ton of bricks, objected vigorously at the public hearing, had Jack cornered in the fire hall with 50 builders growling at him. And then with the assistance of the home builders as parties, we went to LCDC, alleging that a moratorium was a violation of Goal 10, and probably Goal 11. I don't remember all the pleadings. And I distinctly remember Jim Ross, deputy director of the LCD, who Henry didn't like very much, thought he was a lightweight. show up in a three-piece suit to present the department's case in favor of 1,000 Friends of the Home Builders to the commission in very clear tones, very aggressively, very forcefully, something that had never been done before at LCDC, where staff didn't simply present the hearings officer opinion and be willing to answer questions, but it's really the hearings officer's show. These were administrative hearings before the commission on an appeal of a local land use decision. This is before there was a land use board of appeals. Jim was forceful and eloquent about the housing goal, and Henry smiled broadly and said, "We've arrived. We've got this effort underway. It's real." And the commission slam dunk rejected Beaverton's moratorium and told them they had to get rid of it after so many days and not reimpose it unless they could demonstrate that there was a real health hazard emergency or something like that. We ended up, this was more of Henry's magic, representing Betty Niven and the State Housing Council as special assistant attorneys general. Mark and I were appointed by the AG because there'd be a conflict with one agency being represented, or two agencies being represented by the same office if we were appearing before LCDC. State Housing Council versus Lake Oswego. That was the system development charge case. The outrage that a municipality could charge $2,000 a unit in combined sewer, water, and other fees for every residence, and Mark had done some math. I don't think he even applied the Richmond factor, which usually resulted in algorithmic increases. That, over the life of a mortgage, that would be $9,000 some odd dollars. And it was a distinct cost burden on government. So that would have been the high water mark had we won, but it was Mick Gillette in writing the decision for the Court of Appeals rejecting the argument on appeal. Petitioners seem to be confused about the role of LCDC. LCDC is a part of government, not, as petitioners appear to believe, the government. In other words, LCDC can't wave its wand and say that municipalities don't have the right to charge various fees simply because it might have an effect that, from the perspective of the fee, is incidental. So we were spanked by that, but we just kept on going. The city of Milwaukee's use of imprecise, what we now say standards were not clear and objective criteria for treating all apartments as a conditional use was struck down based upon the advocacy we'd made in the St. Helens plan review, I guess. It was an administrative action that developed the St. Helens policy. LCDC didn't have administrative rules back then. So they issued a policy saying a municipality has to provide for all needed housing types in a zone that allows them outright. So that meant that St. Helens couldn't have a policy of using conditional use standards for multifamily or manufactured housing. That's sort of the chronology as I remember it. It was a major threshold issue for 1,000 Friends. We came to it late, but we came to it very forcefully. As Henry pointed out many times thereafter, in 1978, when Measure 10, once again, was on the ballot, the same number, in fact, to repeal the goals and limit LCDC's authority, not strictly a repeal. We won by 60-some% this time, and the home builders endorsed the vote no position. At least the metro home builders did. And so unlike 76, when there were those ads in the Oregonian, you'd open it up and there were these two sad-looking children looking out from the page, dark around them, photographs, sweet-looking kids, very concerned. Where will they live?
Where will our children live?
Where will our children live? Vote yes on Measure 10. We had the home builders on our side, and that was the political outcome Henry wanted, but by that time we were completely inured and imbued with the idea that, as Henry put it, housing is a land use consideration in its own right. Sort of a not particularly profound, but from where we'd come as conservationists, it was a turning point. So when we talked about the next really big case for me, or the case was already going on constantly for me, the Crag urban growth boundary, it was not simply a question of how do we ensure that we're not sprawling onto farmland, but how do we ensure that the mix of housing inside the urban growth boundary responds to all needs. You can't do it with large lots, single family. You can't extrapolate that future for 20 years and expect that we're going to have an affordable housing supply. And then you go into public facilities and services. If we lost the argument that you can't use system development charges because that would burden the cost of housing, how do we nonetheless make sure that municipalities have strategies for funding infrastructure? And Mark had done research about, we learned a lot about municipal finance, looking through the statutes, looking through treatises, trying to understand what the alternatives were to system development charges, but in the process understanding that there were enormous cost burdens that had to be figured out by municipalities, and that we needed to have public facility planning, capital improvement programs and the like in order to carry that out. We got to understand their key role. So we became kind of urban planners as much as conservationists. That was a big change for 1,000 Friends, but it was also not solely because of our efforts. Alan got there first with the Seaman versus City of Durham case, a big change for LCDC and for local governments. I had planners who never told me this until after we started mucking around in Goal 10, that they really supported 1,000 Friends of Oregon, but we were going down the wrong course now. That we were messing with their quality of life issues and their local control and their engagement with their citizenry. St. Helens, Columbia County, I won't name particular planners, but I would bump into people and their sort of friendly visage would be more of a scowl because we'd gone too far. We'd gotten involved too much. Russell Sadler was a commentator on the radio at the City Club and in the papers. I had a column from time to time in the Oregonian and regularly in Ashland and other community papers up and down the state. Russell was a lion-hearted liberal advocate for land use planning and other values, and he drew the line. He had a very provocative headline in the Oregonian when it carried an article or an opinion piece he wrote criticizing the idea that the housing goal should be implemented and enforced the way 1,000 Friends was advocating, that we have to provide for all housing types, densities, lot sizes. We need to reduce the minimum lot size, not expand it. We need to make sure that apartments in sufficient supply can be built without discretionary review, and criteria like quality of life or character of the neighborhood couldn't be used as a discretionary standard by planning commissions because that would lead to exclusionary decisions. Russell wrote that 1,000 Friends is setting up a future in which aggrieved neighborhood advocates and anti-planning rural property owners and developers will find common cause to destroy land use planning. On the contrary, I think we ended up in our own feel our way manner in greatly strengthening how land use planning worked by our advocacy for Goal 10. And certainly by the time city plans started coming in for review, Goal 10 was a leading part of the review of those plans. It was fundamental to what could be accomplished. You saw the legislature respond. This was the home builders saying, okay, we've gotten these wins. Let's nail them down in statute. So many of the decisions that were based upon language that potentially could be interpreted another way in Goal 10 became defined in statute, the clear and objective standards requirement. In 83, when we needed to reform land use planning because we barely won a third referendum or initiative to try to destroy the planning goals. 1,000 Friends and AOI worked together on economic development standards, that the kinds of standards that would have to be in local plans in order to show compliance with the objectives behind the economy of the state goal. And a lot of that work was modeled on the inventory analysis, needs determination approaches in the housing rule and that were outlined in the housing goal. When LCDC decided to approve the Crag urban growth boundary, sorry to jump around here chronologically, but now I'm back in 78, I guess. They bought 1,000 Friends' argument that the boundary was way too big, maybe 25% too large. And so they directed Crag to come up with interim controls, an interim urban growth boundary. In 1980, when they reapproved the same boundary, when it had been resubmitted by Metro, they directed Metro to review and limit low density development and to take interim steps to try to encourage higher density residential development in Washington County, Clackamas County, other parts of the boundary that were outside of cities but were subject to development. And you heard Goal 10 kinds of considerations underlying that. And finally, in the Metropolitan Housing Rule, LCDC said, by naming the cities in Metro, what their minimum overall density targets would be 6, 8, or 10 units per net residential acre in cities of various sizes. Again, an effort to formalize and give definition to the fair share idea behind Mount Laurel's line of cases and inherent in the metropolitan application of Goal 10. You got to figure out what your minimum contribution is going to be. You have to have multifamily, you can't zone it out. You must provide a range of densities in single family or lot sizes. So here's your standard for measuring up. If you're the town of Durham, it's 6. You know, if you're Portland, it's 10, and there's a gradation in between. Now I'm running out of specifics. I did sort of a quick memory dump. So you can
I
ask
have
me
a
some
couple of questions, but the first one is, at this same period of time during the Metro Housing Rule, there was the Multnomah County moratorium, which is a very different kind of approach.
You mean on Sody Island?
No, it was
Oh,
countywide.
that's a little bit later, yeah.
Yeah, wouldn't
Yeah.
issue building permits and.
And DEQ called for that.
That's
Yeah,
correct.
right. So that was a service or a public health related moratorium, which was allowable. I mean, we didn't even question it. I don't know if builders that got caught in it tried to bring challenges of it, but the contrast there was DEQ had finally plumbed the depths of the sand and gravel beneath East Portland and discovered, even with all that drainage, at some point these cesspools and septic tanks have caused infiltration into groundwater, and it's going to get worse if we don't stop it. So they put a sewer order in place, essentially, and that led to the joint annexation efforts of the city of Portland and Gresham, and to a lot of fighting about the Columbia Ridge idea as a third alternative for creating a new municipality, occupying all that land in between. But I don't remember it as a Goal 10.
Goal 11.
Yeah, Goal 11, certainly. Yeah.
And it's beat.
What does the beat mean?
It means it stopped for a moment. Okay, we're back on. Thank you, Si. It's one of the difficulties of technology. It gives you so much time and then it, it goes to sleep and then you just have to click it again.
Well, I wouldn't blame him for going to sleep. Rattling on in a monotone.
No, not
So you're going to become City of Portland Planning Director.
Yeah.
When you're done. So what was it like for you to be now directly involved
Yeah.
at the local level and with implementation?
Well, for housing, it was pretty easy for me to think about the context of the existing city comprehensive plan and zoning code, and not necessarily relate back to the housing goal or to Goal 14 for that matter, except as a groundwork for how I thought about things. And I remember focusing on housing as a consequence of how we dealt with the absence of growth in the city and how we could plan for it in a way that didn't incite opposition in the neighborhoods. And I was more conservative then than I am now in terms of avoiding that kind of reaction from neighbors. We had a town where nothing much was happening. I became planning director in '89. There was, in the 1990 census, as we learned as the data were analyzed and released, it showed that the city of Portland had garnered about 3% of the region's growth in population. Maybe housing starts, I'm not remembering which statistic that was, housing starts or population, in the decade preceding. So we were doing nothing. The largest city in the region was not emptying out, but not growing, and all around us, communities were growing. Now, the early 1980s recession had slowed things down everywhere, but other places had picked up and we weren't picking up. So my objective was to figure out how we could get people into the city, which is something Neil Goldschmidt had talked about nearly a generation earlier when he became mayor, but it was a problem again. And we were looking at what are the places you could put people. I was looking at it, I was obsessing about it. I had a staff that was worried about handling conditional use permits, and the long-range planning program was sort of truncated and had been focused outside the Bureau on the Central City Plan. And I thought it was time for us to look at the city as a whole. It had been since 1980 that we'd done a comprehensive plan. And I started thinking about models for where you could put housing that would have minimal impact. I looked at the existing zoning map, and as today, it started with an intensification on the main streets, somewhat lumpily. We didn't call them main streets, they were just the arterials. And then there would be a low-density multi-dwelling zone for a few blocks in, and maybe a row of row house zoning below that. And then little pockets of yellow in between. And I looked at that and said, well, from where my house is, I only walk a block and a half or so, and then I'm in a row house zone. Then another couple of blocks of low-density apartment before I get to Division. But these are all houses. This can be hell to pay if we actually build out that way. So I was trying to come up with strategies for encouraging more multi-dwelling and accessory dwellings in single-family neighborhoods, make them permitted outright. And, you know, I went with Steve Dodder, Grace Kreniken, Ethan Seltzer, a couple of other people, G.B. Arrington, and Andy Catugno, to Toronto in 1990. There was an APA conference, or North American Planning Association conference, and we tried to understand how Toronto was growing. Subway system and streetcars and these amazing main streets, Jane Jacobs Main Street, across the north part of just sort of the separation of downtown and the rest of the city. Why am I blanking on it? Many people know the name of that road. Has a subway in it. Anyway, a classic of what we were starting to think about. Here's subways underneath the street, but at each subway station, there's a cluster of mid-rise and in some cases high-rise buildings. And then we would walk 5 blocks into the neighborhood, and there would be houses very much like the house I owned in Portland, clad in brick rather than wood siding, but you know, 4 square, hipped roof. Right there. So there was this clearly defined bubble of intensity around transit and along the main street, shops and people walking and moderate levels of traffic and lots of people coming up out of the ground from the subway. And we could do that in Portland. We've got this light rail, we've got ambitions to have more, we've got these main streets, there's a pattern in the inner east side of streets like that. If we could intensify that use more than anything we've seen so far, Division Street was a 1-story, auto-oriented street. Hawthorne had some 2-story buildings. There were old apartments in Northwest, but we didn't have a lot of vertical development. So we worked at that. We called it the Livable City Project. We tried to identify these forms, paradigms, Main Street, transit station, central city, and infill in existing neighborhoods, emphasizing a lot the accessory dwelling unit. And anticipating the kind of backlash, any kind of conversation about increased residential density, we went on the road with the visual preference survey. Anton Nellison from Princeton? Rutgers, yes. Had a sugar-coated slideshow that he used that showed various developments at the same residential density, but with remarkably different designs. So people would look at them, and sometimes we would have a higher density, nice design, lower density, poor, auto-oriented design, and people would universally click the number for the slide showing the higher density but nicely designed, leafy, set back a little bit but not too far from the street. And so we took that as evidence that people would respond well to good design at higher densities. I left before we could implement the livable city program, but we had begun rezoning the city in a series of community plans or district plans, to use a generic term. First in Albina, and then in outer southeast, the new part of the city. And we were just really ramping up the outer southeast plan and starting to talk to southwest neighborhoods about going there as well, and talking about these concepts of center and Main Street when I was called to other duties by the chairman or the commissioner in charge of the bureau. I was asked not to perform that duty anymore, at least.
Were there conflicts associated with that?
Oh, well, there were conflicts associated with the regulation of residential development, yeah. In Southwest, we were simultaneously redesignating the city for environmental protection under Goal 5. And we had a couple of zones, the environmental protection zone and the environmental conservation zone, that we applied using the best evidence we had of the location of natural resource areas. Stream beds, forested slopes, the slough, riparian areas generally, using aerial photography and overlay mapping. Not a whole lot of high-tech stuff. We were sort of McCartney rather than GIS-based still, in that work at least. And in Southwest, there were a lot of wooded slopes, there were a lot of deep ravines, there were a lot of creeks, and therefore a lot of application of this overlay. And it was poorly understood how it was going to be implemented. We had a pretty good idea that environmental protection meant you can't build there. Environmental conservation meant you were going to have to provide some protections. The Goal 10 guide, here it is, it's coming out, you're right, Jim. I said, gang, we need to assure that for every parcel or every development area that somebody brings in, we can shift the density that could have been on the side of that ravine and in the absence of an environmental zone into relatively lower impact or even undesignated areas. So if you've got an environmental protection area and it could have had 5 units, get those 5 units out and change the lot configuration, work with the developer to figure out ways of doing that, and let them know in advance, we're not gonna reduce the number of units on your parcel. We're gonna work with you. And you know, the guys push back. I can't sell attached units. I can't sell a 4,000 square foot lot in a neighborhood like this. Look, people want to buy this thing. You know, I'll take a big backyard, but gotta have a lot of them, and I gotta count down and stuff and all this stuff. And they wanted to build it the way they'd always built it, and yeah, that got me fired. But you know, it was the implementation of it in particular cases that was troubling to a lot of them. We were simultaneously reviewing subdivision permits and mapping this stuff. So at least one or more property owners got caught in a situation where they'd already gotten a planned unit development approved by the hearings officer. And then we applied environmental zoning during the course of that. But you know, it wouldn't have applied immediately until they came in for building permits. Then we told them, look, we're gonna have to look at where you're proposing to put the house on the lot and move it over to get it out of that environmental conservation area. And guys who thought they'd missed the terror of environmental zoning were caught in that process. that was a tough implementation decision, and I was a purist. I said, it's possible to achieve both objectives. We can build a house, and we can set it back from the resource, but it meant the guys would have to redesign their configuration of that lot or several lots in a PUD they'd already gone through. I told them we'd go to bat for them if they needed to move a PUD, move a line in the PUD, and they just went berserk because they'd already paid good money to get that plat. So yeah, that was a bad deal. Well, for everybody, including me.
No, but there is also a teachable moment.
Yeah.
I mean, so
it's all about why you pursue a course of developing policy and then applying the policy. And we had an ongoing development program happening in Southwest. In fact, it was one of the few areas where there was some vitality in the single-family market in Portland.
So on the east side and the west side, as developers learned, which they did, that lower densities could be achieved. Higher densities could be achieved. What did you see in the city on the implementation side about relationships between the development community and respective neighborhoods? Because this time you start to have the neighborhood organization.
Yeah, well, the neighborhood organizations were there all along, and the ones that were new to the game were the ones in the outer east side. So they had existed as associations in Multnomah County. They carried that identity forward. Many of them, the leadership had been involved in the struggle to try to create a community called Columbia Ridge, which would have been formed by essentially a super annexation or consolidation with the town of Wood Village, I guess. Little tiny city would have become a 120,000 person city by that mode. And Portland and Gresham fought it in court and managed to get the Boundary Commission approval thrown out and continued their annexation program successfully with a lot of hard feelings along the way. That occurred while I was in Earl's office as his chief of staff before I was planning director. Earl was trying resolutely to come up with strategies to soften the blow, like find ways of reducing the cost of a sewer installation on a street and to individual lots. And the Environmental Services Bureau was pushing back as a utility has to. They had to recover those costs. When I left, as I said, the Outer Southeast Plan, which later became the Rose District Plan, was underway in the public involvement and issues and policies phase, but hadn't started talking about zoning strategies. It resulted in broad application of wide swaths of low and medium density multi-dwellings zoning going into what had been single dwelling neighborhoods, were single dwelling neighborhoods. And there was no response from the development bureaus about a strategy to deal with unpaved streets, absence of sidewalks, discontinuous streets. You'd have something like this, then you'd have somebody come in with a private drive and have houses all along it that didn't face any street, but it would break up the possibility of having streets cutting through those super blocks. It was a mess, and it became a more painful mess when the zoning increased in certain areas and the market came back. So we saw a lot of apartment building that was, in the eyes of the neighborhood leaders, outrageous, located on streets that didn't have the best facilities. They had a sewer line available that could be extended, but usually extended through that kind of private street arrangement rather than through the full development of the street. And the Transportation Bureau, and Water Bureau, and other service bureaus were fine with those kinds of ad hoc arrangements. There was no master street plan or anything else to accomplish change in the fabric that could support that higher density. So there was backlash, and we're still hearing it.
So you've now taken on a role as an elected official at a regional government, and you have the opportunity to watch the reaction of how goal 10 plays within the multiple number of jurisdictions within the region, and its acceptance of fair share and allocation and other kinds of things. And also watched this hyperinflation in at least end user housing, which is creating a displacement of population. Some areas are succeeding better than what anybody would have ever anticipated.
In terms of development and market
Right.
response, yeah.
And others, not so much. Any observations in kind of your analytic role, not as a policymaker, Bob, but somebody that's been a true practitioner of Goal 10, the subject of land use, and now kind of regional, from a regional perspective in the issues of integration. How do you, what are your thoughts about where we are today, where are the conflicts, where are the alliances, where are the potholes in the road?
Yeah.
And at this regional level, well, where are the alliances?
Well, my shorthand for this is that there's only so much can be done with zoning regulation and land use policy. You also have to invest in infrastructure, right? We know that about sewer, water, streets. What I've come to understand is that housing that's affordable to people who can't afford market housing is a form of infrastructure that requires public investment. And until we, as we develop strategies for providing that kind of investment beyond the tax credit system for nonprofits and even for-profit developers for individual projects, to have something beyond the housing authority in terms of resources that get applied by general government to the provision of below market housing is, I think, where we have to be next. City of Portland, I think ahead of a lot of our expectations, succeeded in passing a housing bond. It's still fraught with difficulty. You can't loan the full faith and credit of the state to a private entity. So you've got all this money to invest in housing, but you can't sell the land to somebody who agrees to build a certain kind of housing because you're lending the credit of the state with that bond money. How do we use the limitations in our Constitution and unleash that money? How do we use the construction excise tax revenue that the city has also adopted? And how do we do it in a way that, the combination of inclusionary zoning, which I love as an idea, and the construction excise tax are both mechanisms that raise the pro forma cost. That show additional costs per unit on any multi-dwelling development. If I can't get a market return on these 8 units, the amount I have to charge on the other units in rent, or that I have to regain in some fashion to satisfy my investors, takes it out of the range of the market. It's going to reduce my return, and I'm not sure I can get people to go in. So how do we bundle together? How does the government bundle together enough incentives in the form of waiver of system development charges or reductions of them, in the form of a cash payment from the CET, the Construction Excise Tax Fund, to make it feasible to add those permanently affordable or long-term affordable units in a private development? How does the Housing Bureau use the resources of the bond to build or incentivize the building of a sufficient number of units to make a difference and persuade the voters when it comes time to consider a second bond that enough has been done to merit continued investment? And how does the regional government look at the experiences of the city of Portland and say, chances are for a number of years there won't be another local government following that example, and it may be appropriate for the regional government to go to the people for a bond, to go to the legislative assembly for authorization to have a supplemental construction excise tax. Perhaps it could fill in on any city that doesn't adopt its own CET that's allocated for housing. We have this little tiny CET, construction excise tax for planning, but a full 1% would yield several tens of millions of dollars that could be invested around the region in places that might not otherwise be receptive and where affordable housing providers might not find much welcome. I'm thinking of cities lining the west bank of the Willamette River, south of Portland, for example, where there isn't any program for affordable housing at the municipal level. Metro could step in and work with community development corporations, housing providers, if it had resources, and if the city's experiment with its bond and its construction excise tax give us some models that we can learn from and try to apply region-wide, consistent with existing zoning, but a new form of investment in those opportunities that should exist in every part of the region.
In your so capital formation, you've identified as an opportunity, if you will. But a lot of your conversation, your commentary earlier today, you raised the issue about how different plans didn't necessarily maybe integrate with bureaus and interagency coordination among themselves. And how do you see any of that being a contributor to impeding the aspirations of Goal 10? You mentioned the streets, so you build streets, but you've got sewer, but you necessarily don't have the streets. You have developers that you have an identity that certain areas could be planned for greater densities, but there's no quick buy-in by the development community. Sometimes there is. Why? All of these other pieces in terms of interagency, application, have you watched that in your experience both as a city planner, as an attorney with 1,000 Friends, and now at Metro? Where do you see kind of where the rubs occur, and what are the potential alliances that can be built around certain visions?
Well, geez. Every city in Oregon has it better than the city of Portland because they follow the city manager form of government. There are some other exceptions, of course, but some of the problems you're describing are endemic or inherent in the form of government in Portland. And it takes an extraordinary mayor and extraordinary collaboration from the commissioners to achieve that kind of integration. Okay, what are we going to do in a context of planning our facility development that coordinates ambitions around affordable housing, transportation, and the water and sewer services? And how do you integrate the Bureau of Buildings and its inspection process and the independent inspection processes of water and environmental services in that mix? There have been, before, during, and after my time at the city, there have been many calls for and efforts to create a one-stop shopping, a quick access permit center where everybody comes to the table, everybody gives clear answers. And it's worked better in the past. It could work much better than it ever has. Bud Clark encouraged Earl Blumenauer, who had environmental services, transportation, and planning for 4 years, or parts of 4 years, to go ahead and play with that. And he appointed ombudsman people, Austin Raglione, Kevin Constan, to run the trap lines. And poor Kevin, smart young man, at a bureau-wide meeting where I'm talking to my planners, Kevin's there, sitting in as well, and various planners in the development review section saying, looking sidelong at Kevin, what do we do when we're pressured to approve permits that we might not otherwise want to approve? And I said, what I hope we'll always be open to is intellectual pressure, to make sure that we're thinking at our best, to ensure that if there's a way to get to yes, we try to get there, consistent with what the standards of the code are. There are these inherent behaviors and suspicions and beliefs, even in an integrated bureau like planning. Today, we have long-range planning and we have development review. From one perspective, that's great because the development review planners who do subdivision and conditional use work are right there in the same bureau as the inspectors and well, the building inspectors and permitters, but they're divorced from the long-range planners, the people who are building the dreams and devising strategies. Transportation, from time to time, has been closely integrated. I know they're a very important part of the planning process in the long-range comprehensive planning. I don't have a good sense of where they are on the ground, other than the efforts that Leah Treat has been bringing to increase safety across the city, which means sidewalks, bike paths. It means more interconnected street systems, and that's a key issue in East Portland. So on a policy-by-policy basis, you see movement in the right direction, but as you go up the ladder on the council, between the different bureaus and the different commissioners, it takes a lot of coordination, a lot of common purpose that's very difficult to achieve in that commission form of government.
So, and not to put on your spot, literally not to put you on the spot as an elected, because in the role that you play and the friction that occurs between Metro and various cities within the region, it's natural. You've got layering of government.
Yeah. Nobody else has to live this way.
Yeah, right. But what do you see, as specifically as it relates to Goal 10, and because of the role that Metro does in terms of allocating, to ensuring that there's an adequate land supply, if you will, functionally on the ground, getting that land supply out, getting local governments to accept, quote, their fair share in their own perspective, if you will, about respective densities and the like. Do you see, have you identified any challenges there?
Yeah, I think a lot has changed. Not while I was watching it necessarily, but the Metro I joined, started running for in 2009, 2010, and joined in 2013 as a counselor, is not really engaged in the review of the adequacy of local planning for housing or other issues, or critiquing actively amendments and changes. It's possible for Metro to, and Metro occasionally does, review legislative enactments under consideration that come up through the LCDC notification process and advise local governments if we think that they're incompatible with the regional framework plan and its objectives about development, and whether it conforms with Goal 10 requirements. But that's not a big body of work. There's part of a planner assigned to that kind of work, and there's usually something else that has to be done. And frankly, we've got a big canvas of land that's been planned for a long time, and local governments have very few resources to change those plans, so there's not a lot of activity there. It's not as if Lake Oswego every week is rolling out some new way of limiting residential development, or increasing residential development in parts of its city. Those are tough things to undertake. We do have a grant program, and that grant program, along with LCDC's planning grants, are probably the main sources of planning resource for local governments in this metropolitan area. So, could we devise a set of grants to encourage people to work on affordable housing? Yeah, we've done that. Our latest round of construction excise tax funded 2040 grants are aimed at housing production, particularly affordable housing. So I think we have about $300,000 that we're putting out in 300 plus in grants to local governments who come forward with problems they want to solve in their own zoning code or projects they want to explore. And I can't off the top of my head name the 4 or 5 cities that have undertaken them. Milwaukee and Portland are among them, to come up with new strategies for housing affordability. That's about as far as we've programmed ourselves to go I and others on the council, particularly Sam Chase, have been talking about Metro's role in coming up with more robust funding that goes beyond planning and goes into development of housing itself. Are we motivated by Goal 10? Yeah, in principle, all the way back at the cellular level. That's why we think this way now, because we have that body of law. But it's not as if we're going around citing Goal 10. On occasion, the group that Ed Sullivan helped form, Housing Advocates, has written us notes asserting that we should be exercising authority under both the Fair Housing Act amendments and the rules and Goal 10, and we've not chosen to do that. The arguments are a little too complex for us, given the focus that the Metro Council has had, certainly, and the focus that our staff has. We don't see ourselves as housing rights advocates or as people who are the first line of defense against violations of Goal 10. We're in Gustafson's era, the first round of Metro's existence. LCDC wanted Metro to be the local coordinating body that would ensure compliance with the goals, and Metro undertook some of that work. It's fallen away, and that role doesn't exist in any meaningful way that comes to the council's attention today.
If you were to make a short list of, and this is basically two more questions, the first one being this one that I'm going to ask, and the last one just kind of any final observations. But specifically, if you were to make a short list of how could we ensure the encouragement of what Goal 10 talks about in terms of encouraging cities, what would you suggest? That we've talked about capital assistance in planning. What would be kind of your priority list with you drawing on your experience intellectually? What would you put in place? Not in terms of solution, but what are the challenges, the problems in terms of actually moving towards an aspirational goal like Goal 10 when we're faced with, quote, this identified housing crisis that we currently are facing?
Well, it's always timely to consider doing a review of local planning procedures and zoning code provisions to ensure that we really are maintaining compliance with Goal 10's basics, that multi-dwelling development, manufactured housing is available under clear and objective standards in all communities, that communities are not excessively applying large minimum lot sizes to otherwise buildable land at more conventional 5,000 square foot realm of lot size. You know, if somebody wants to buy 2 lots and build a house, that's okay, but don't plat it at 10,000 square feet. That's a long range, tune-up kind of approach. What we really need, I think, is focused attention on finding those sites that have potential but have barriers, like an inadequate street system, like somewhat understandable neighborhood opposition, and finding affordable forms that really aren't provided for in many zoning codes. And I'd look to, I'm sorry to be 67 years old, the guy who runs Orange Spot Development, who's on the planning.
Eli.
Yeah, Eli Spivak. And others who've come up with really innovative ideas about cluster housing and courtyard housing and other approaches, which rely on finding a fair piece of ground, which is a relatively short supply, and putting it together, and then building something that's innovative and doesn't offend the neighborhood, unless the neighborhood's hyper prickly. I like what 1000 Friends is doing. I don't know if they've got exactly the right tone yet, but they've worked with Eli and others to have their own advocacy for housing intensification and affordable housing, going to neighborhood associations and watching their spokesperson state the premise at group like my Richmond Neighborhood Association is entertaining, except that it has affected my blood pressure to hear my neighbors' responses to it. To have that kind of advocacy for making sure that our neighborhoods are accessible to all Oregonians, everyone who wants to find a home in Portland or in Portland suburbs. Very fundamental, but so many of my neighbors and neighborhoods across this region believe that they're all done, that what they have now is exactly right. There's no need to change anything. And if people need a place to live, they should find it somewhere else, which is exactly what the township of Mount Laurel said in the 1970s. And the whole idea behind Goal 10 is, we're going to figure out a way to share this wonderful place. And we're going to do it in a way that ensures households of all means can come in. That means public investment to provide some of that housing or to incentivize its development by the private sector. It means ensuring that we remove barriers in the form of zoning to that development, and that we don't layer up the historic preservation and design standards for new development. You know, yes, you can build 15 units to the acre in this area, subject to these review processes, which inevitably lead to my neighbors saying, this isn't compatible with the character of our neighborhood. And we're right back to ground zero.
Because compatibility has a linkage to density.
I mean,
Well,
adverse
Yeah.
linkage to this,
Right.
from their perspective.
Exactly. And that perspective is well endowed by people of certain means who've lived in those neighborhoods for a good long time or moved into them because they like the way they are, and are not prepared to see change. And change can be pretty small and still set them off. I'm rambling a little bit, Jim. I don't think there's a single
No, this
answer
is,
to what you're talking about.
well,
Ergo,
the challenge
right.
that we're trying to deal with. So, closing comments, Bob. You've had close to 40-year history in this game.
And I still haven't solved the problem, have I?
And, but you have some perspective, anything that you would share that we can learn from?
I'm just going to repeat that one thing I said fairly late in this discussion, that I think we've reached a point where we can't rely on planning and zoning, that is sort of passive governmental reaction to private initiative. We have to have activist planning to help the private sector identify areas and come up with redevelopment strategies. It may be the old PDC model, it may be something more nimble, but we have to keep at it. And we have to invest in housing in the same way that we have invested over the long haul in sewer, water, and sometimes streets. Absolutely.
Thank you very, very much. Great interview.